Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Witcover, the Associate Dean of the Online MFA, and I'm joined, as I am most nights for the Wireside Chat, by my colleague, Instructor Melissa Hart, and our special guest tonight is Instructor Frank Sennett. Let me give you a quick intro, Frank. Let's see here.
Well, thanks for having me, first of all, while you look that up.
Absolutely.
I am thrilled. I just love SNHU. I'm fairly new, but I feel like in some way it was destiny that brought me to this program and to you, Paul. So
Oh, wow.
I hope I don't mess it up because I love
Yeah,
it.
don't screw up or you'll be fired. No, just kidding.
Hey, totally fine. I get it. It happens.
All right. I do have your bio here somewhere, I swear. Okay, here it is. I had it up. Okay. Frank Sennett has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Montana and a journalism degree from Northwestern University. He taught creative writing in the UCLA Extension Writers Program, as did I, before coming to SNHU. He has published 9 books. His recent thriller, Shadow State, was named Best New Novel by a Chicagoan in the 2023 Chicago Reader Best of Chicago Awards. His work in progress is a psychological thriller on which he's been grateful to receive useful feedback from some of his workshop students. Frank lives in Chicago with his wife, 3 children, and 2 cats, and a lot of boxes of Annie's mac and cheese.
That is true.
So, and Melissa just put the link to Frank's website in the chat. So I hope you will take a moment to pay him a visit at some point, maybe buy some of his books. So what I guess the place I'd like to start, Frank, is you have a journalism degree, you've worked as a reporter. Did that lead you into fiction, or were you always writing fiction, at the same time?
I was always writing fiction at the same time. My 3 paths in life as a young, oh no, say 4 as a kid: stand-up comedy, radio disc jockey,
Really?
fiction writer, journalist. And as I told you, Paul, when I was a teenager out in Montana, I used to subscribe to the Washington Post Weekly, where I used to read your dad.
Yep.
Sometimes. So when I met you, I was kind of a fanboy about him. Always been into politics, was a political columnist for a while. But yeah, I've always written fiction. And when I graduated from journalism school, I graduated into the George H.W. Bush recession. That's how old I am. And so I worked for a year and then hightailed it into grad school and got my MFA. And I never looked back I could continue to write. I was in journalism as well when I got out of my MFA program, but I've always written.
And Melissa shares a bit of a journalism background and still works in journalism as a freelance journalist.
Yep. Oh, all right. Yeah, I run a newsroom to this day. So yeah.
Wow. So what is the talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the balance that you have to maintain between, on the one hand, adherence in journalism to just the facts, and allowing your imagination to take free rein in your fiction.
Yeah, so I write grounded stories grounded in reality. I don't write a lot of speculative fiction. And I think what I bring to bear from my journalism background are an ability to research in depth, which you can also have as a scholar, and love history in particular, and then the ability to kind of cut to the marrow of what needs to be told, to a fault sometimes. As one of my writer friends told me when he reviewed the manuscript for Shadow State, he said, "Why don't you put a cup of coffee in somebody's hand?" At some point. So my pacing, I tell the students, like, when we get to the pacing week, I'm like, I may not be the guy to teach you this, because propulsive is what I go for typically.
Right. Well, I mean, you're writing a thriller. Shouldn't a thriller have a propulsive pace?
I think so. So, but yeah, and I also think that oddly, my writing style may be increasingly suited for the shorter attention spans or the more in-demand attention spans of everybody. They may not be shorter, but there's just so many options. There's everything from Twitter and TikTok to every book in the Gutenberg project and everything in between. So I have told my editor that and also it's, paper is really expensive. And I tell him, I'm like, it's going to be cheaper for you to publish my books because they're shorter and people will want to read them. He's not necessarily sold on that argument, but.
Right. I'm sure that's gotten you much larger advances, right? Because the money
Oh,
that he's
yeah.
saving
Oh,
right.
you know it. Well, you just told me you were 60,000 words into your latest project, and 60,000 for me is like, that's a draft. And I try
Right.
I get it to 70 and then I'm pretty much done.
Yeah,
So
I mean
that's, yeah.
the book I wrote before this one was the shortest I've ever written, and that was like 49,998 or something. And this seems like more of my usual length, but then I'm writing speculative fiction, right? Where a 100,000 word manuscript is not considered to be overly long by any means.
Not
Melissa,
at
did you
all.
have a question?
I just wanted to know Frank's position on audiobooks.
Oh, yeah. Audiobooks are books. I mean, I listen to books all the time when I was commuting from the northwest side of Chicago downtown every day and giving my son a ride to high school, add an extra half hour onto my ride. It was fine because I just listened to books. And my son and I would listen to books and I would listen to them on my own. We went through the entire Asimov Foundation series
Oh,
and the
wow.
Empire and the robots and everything. And that took a while. And I think the last book we read together, and we actually had the print version, was Seven Eves. So he's a big SF guy,
Yeah,
and
that's a Neil Stevenson book, I believe. Yeah.
yeah, and people do take issue with the politics of it, but he's a hell of a writer. I mean, he just knows how to tell a story. And Snow Crash explains more about our current day as so much speculative fiction does than just about anything that's being written now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would say Neil Stevenson and Kim Stanley Robinson are both speculative fiction writers with a lot to say about the present moment. Definitely. So I want to remind our audience that if you have questions for Frank, please type them into the chat and we will make sure that he answers them. We're going to put him on the spot.
There's one right here.
Okay, go ahead.
Natasha Barker says, did you have any anxiety publishing your first novel? And if so, what helped you work through that anxiety? This person is writing a fantasy novel and the anxiety has been making the process difficult.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I've had certainly my share of anxiety related to writing over the years. I wrote my two first novels in the MFA program, two mysteries, both about 55,000 words, fairly short. And I sent them around. I had an agent because back then Montana was a hot MFA program like Iowa. It no longer is, but back then it was like number two after Iowa. So I was picked up by ICM like right away, and
Wow.
nothing sold. Nothing sold. But all my short stories were being submitted to the New Yorker, and I thought, well, I'm going to be somebody. And the novel went around, and nothing happened with it. And so I just put it in a drawer. Went to work as a journalist, and then I guess it was, and I would continue to write. I wrote some screenplays with a friend of mine, unproduced. And anyway, I did have a lot of anxiety back then, and nothing happened. And this is kind of before, this was just on the lip of, Amazon publishing and all that. So this would be like the early 90s. And so one day, it's funny, all the anxiety of that was gone. I was just kind of doing it. I was reviewing fiction for Booklist, and I was writing some fiction, but I wasn't really publishing much. I'd published like one online short story. And I got a call. I had written a profile of Lawrence Block, one of my favorite writers, with the Matt Scudder series and some other series for Booklist. And also, my dad turned me on to my stepdad was the speculative fiction guy. My mom and my dad turned me on to crime novels. And so I cut my teeth at the age of 12 on the Matt Helm books, which are pretty cheesy, but at the time, I mean, that was like amazing, this secret agent, et cetera. So I did Donald Hamilton before he died. I went and met him in Connecticut and wrote a big story on, this is after 9/11, and the great money quote from, I said, what do you think Matt Helm would have done about 9/11? And he said, well, he would have stopped it. And he would have. So these guys who did, I think the Mystery Scene guys called me and they said, we really like what you've written for Book List. Do you have any novels in your drawer that you're unpublished? And I said, in fact, right here in my drawer, I have 2 manuscripts. So they published them both. They had a deal with a small publishing house. And so it was just like serendipitous, but I had years of anxiety and years of beating my head against the wall. And the lesson I think I learned from that was just keep doing things that are writing or writing adjacent. And, the only way, it's like they say, if you can't win if you don't play, as far as the lottery and whatever. And so I was writing these stories that for a certain audience were getting, quite a bit of notice. I was nominated for the Helen Naring Award for book reviewing at one point. Was one of the mystery groups, and so within that little rarefied space, I started to make a little bit of a name for myself, and that got my novels published. So I would just say, keep doing it, keep writing, keep doing the work, and just make a plan. I went on an agent search a couple years ago, and agent searches have gotten way harder than they used to be because they're inundated with queries all the time. And I had a spreadsheet and the number of no responses I got. And this, I'm like, I've published a lot of books, and that may have been not in my favor. But anyway, yeah, I think you just have to. It's like hard rock mining. I mean, you just have to keep at it and not listen to those voices in your head that are telling you stink. And it is my only piece of advice is just to keep doing it and putting it out there. And people have sold major books who started with fan fiction. I mean, there's a lot of ways into this business. And then creative writing programs like this, they can help you make connections. I always talk with my students about stay connected. Everybody stay connected. And I hear from you. I want to help you if I can. And, maybe I'll ask one of them for an agent someday.
Yeah, and I mean the great thing, I mean, you said that was a very serendipitous occasion that led to the publication of your first 2 novels, but in reality, it was something you were ready for. You had prepared for that, even though you didn't know it was going to happen in that manner. You had those manuscripts ready to go. When somebody made the query to you, you were able to respond positively because you had done the work and you had kind of lived what you're advocating now, which is to, keep writing, keep persisting, persevere. Those are all important qualities, I think.
Yeah, my favorite story, just very briefly, if any of you read Adrian McKinty at all. I haven't met him in person yet, but we're the same age. We've gotten to be pretty friendly on social media, and he gave me a blurb for my book, which I'm grateful for. I owe him a bottle of scotch. Anyway, he has written a few series that I just loved, and I was the first person to review him at all. Like a book list review was the first review published on one of not his first novel. And I just loved him. I'm like, this is a major new talent, whatever. So he remembered me, of course, when I reached out to him. But he was going to give up writing. He had written this wonderful series, very well reviewed. I listened to them on audiobook because there's this narrator called Gerard Doyle, who's this Irish guy. It's just beautiful, beautiful narration. And this guy, Sean Duffy, is his character in this series, and he's a Protestant cop in the Irish, the troubles, during the troubles with all the Catholics, and he's the one proddy cop, and it's just gets into all this harrowing stuff. And these books were amazing. Well, they weren't well promoted, they weren't well published, they died on the vine, and he got kicked out of his house. He was living in Australia with his wife, who's an academic, and his child, and he said there's nothing like seeing a 12-year-old daughter standing on the lawn going, where are we going to live, Dad? And so he gave up writing. He was going to drove Uber, he was going to bartend, and then he had a serendipitous thing with this guy named Shane Salerno, who's kind of a writer and agent of a few people who heard about him through Don Winslow, who he had met at a conference. So again, go to conferences. So McKinty had met Winslow at a conference and given him a piece of a short story, and it turned into The Chain, which was a huge bestseller and put McKinty on the map with those of us who are not just mystery aficionados. And then he wrote, I think The Island was his follow-up. But anyway, $6 million film deals. He's swimming in it now. But he was not an overnight success, and he literally gave up. And Salerno called him, and it was 3 a.m. in Australia, and told him, I heard about this, you can't quit. I'm going to wire 20 grand into your account right now. Give me the account number, and I want you to stay up until you're done with 20,000 words and send it to me. And that was it. And his wife was like, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Something crazy is happening. Just hang tight."
Yeah.
And his life completely changed. And that was a guy who was quote unquote successful. This business is, as all of you know at some level, Paul, Melissa, it's a tough business unless you're one of those really rarefied people. And same kind of thing happened to Mick Herron, who does the Slough House books adapted into the Slow Horses series on Apple TV Plus. So,
Great show.
Anyway, there's every reason to think that if you stick with it, and you have some talent, it will surface.
Yeah, I'm a believer in that. I mean, you'll find your readers will find you, or you'll find your readers one way or the other.
Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting question. It says, since you've compiled a book of 400 quotable quotes, what's your favorite quote to encourage writing students?
My favorite quote. Well, back when you and I taught at UCLA Extension and did not run across each other, which to my regret, I used to teach a humor writing class in which I would have them do a virtual interview with Mark Twain, because I had a huge compendium of Mark Twain quotes, several books of his. And I'm trying to think of an exact one, but Twain would be kind of my go-to guy for a quote like that. I'm trying to think of what else. I think was it Dashiell Hammett who talked about, whenever you get stuck writing a scene, just send 2 guys in through the door with a gun.
Yeah, it was one of those hard-boiled guys said that.
Yeah, and I kind of live by that. I'm the send 2 guys through the door with a gun kind of writer.
Yeah, that's a good. The science fiction writer Gene Wolfe would allude to that and say that in his stories, he always brought somebody down through the ceiling, but the same idea.
Yeah.
So you've had a very varied background. I mean, you mentioned working in radio. You mentioned stand-up comedy. Are these things that you pursue? And again, how in what way have these pursuits or passions found their way into your work?
Well, I gave up stand-up, thankfully for the world, after high school. But I went into college and got known in the freshman Facebook. They did write-ups on some freshmen that had notable things in their essays, and I was the runner-up. Showtime used to do this Funniest Person in America competition, and they did state level competitions, and I was Showtime's second funniest person in Montana, which I always thought was beautiful.
That's great. Hey, you weren't as funny, but you tried harder.
I tried hard, yeah. So I was 18, and that was kind of the apex of my stand-up career. But I still, humor is huge to me. I love humor, and in terms of radio,
thrillers. I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you put humor into your thrillers as well?
Oh yeah. I try to, like somebody's in a station house and goes to grab a donut, and the guy says, "Oh, that don't eat that. That was a day-old donut 3 days ago."
Yeah.
So I try to throw in, just offbeat lines like that. But right. I'm not like Westlake. I'm not pretending to the throne of Parker, but I would be more on the Richard Stark end of Westlake than the Dortmunder end of Westlake. And so, so the Parker novels are kind of my alpha and omega, and Dashiell Hammett and you know, a lot
Right.
of those guys. That's why I write so short, I think, because those novels were all short.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have much time for writing amidst all the drinking they were doing.
Dashiell Hammett, man, he knew how to party.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you a moment ago. If you
Oh
want.
no, I was just gonna say I didn't really. I did some radio, public radio stuff for 7 or 8 years, but just like a weekly, a short kind of thing. So I never pursued either of those as careers, but it was just writing. You know, so if you're writing comedy, you're writing radio stuff, you're right. You know, it was all under the umbrella of writing. That's all I ever wanted to do was write and be famous, which
Yeah.
I've given up. But when I
No,
was a
you're
kid,
going to be famous. Come on, this webinar thing is going to go out. This Wireside chat will be seen by millions. Believe me.
I am so excited about that.
So I want to talk a little bit about the thriller because as a genre, because that's something that I would say, it's not uncommon to have students in our program working on thrillers, but it's probably not the most common genre that people are writing in. So, but I think a lot of different genres can benefit from some of the, the tropes and elements of thrillers, such as pacing that you mentioned earlier. So, can you talk a little bit about like those elements of a thriller? What is it about the thriller genre that is distinctive and sets it apart? And also, what elements of thrillers can you profitably adopt into other genres?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I've got at least one student in the current term writing a thriller, and I had a couple last term. So it is a lot. I'm seeing a lot of romantasy, a lot of speculative fiction.
Yeah.
That seems to be, and publishers' lunch now, or romantasy is an official genre now. It's like we've
That's the
seen the
big
birth
one.
of a new genre. That and young adult
Or new adult.
went into new adult.
Right.
So we've had 2 new genres birthed in the last 5 years, and so it's an exciting time in fiction. But in terms of what you can bring from the thriller, I think it's that supercharged version of building a plot by throwing obstacles in the protagonist's way. Because a thriller just lives and dies on that. You can't be bored. I mean, Le Carré is probably my favorite writer in the genre of espionage thrillers, and he writes 500-page or wrote huge novels with George Smiley, who's just an amazing character. And I just read his son's Carla's Game.
How is that?
Wonderful, and
Yeah,
I thought this is either going to be terrible or I'm going to love it, and I loved it.
Well, his son is a fantastic writer. He's a well-known speculative fiction writer.
Right. He's got a whole different gig,
Yeah, he's the real deal. But I'm a big Le Carré fan as well, and haven't read that one yet. So I'm glad to hear that it's worth picking up.
Couldn't believe how good it was. It was as if his dad had written it.
Yeah. What an incredible
what are the odds of that?
Yeah, but what a beautiful homage to his father. That says a lot about what their relationship must have been like.
Right, and his mother. I mean, because he says
Right.
The thing that people didn't understand about the Cornwalls was that they wrote together. She was there reading all of his drafts and giving him plot points, and
Interesting.
he wrote the main part, but he said his mom was very deeply involved in all the books. So yeah, so it was a labor of love for both of them. So
there are so many questions in this chat.
Why don't you grab one, Melissa?
What's your best advice for writing fight scenes?
Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, that's good. I try to keep them believable. Although I love those like Netflix thrillers where crazy things happen. I don't usually have people like hanging by their fingernails off of Air Force One and stuff. But so I try to keep them believable, but I try to make them really visceral. I think you should stay with some really significant details. Find that one image in the fight that's going to stick with people as they turn the page. Like you know, how you know, there's that kind of body horror aspect when somebody's getting beaten up and or getting shot at or whatever, and you think about, and it makes you think about like what does it feel like to get one of your teeth knocked out, you know? So which is makes me kind of queasy as a human being, but as a writer, I mean, I want people to really have that experience as they're reading. So I would say those are the things. I had a torture scene in Shadow State that was kind of the turning point of the book, and um you know, it's adjacent to a fight scene, and just all of the specific stuff that this guy does to the protagonist was just you know, and but I thought it was important to raise the stakes, and that particular chapter starts off with my favorite line that I've ever written: pain is information.
Mm.
Because it really said a lot about the protagonist's mindset. You know, he's
Yeah.
not a Superman, but he was in combat in Afghanistan. He led the Secret Service detail of the president. He is somebody who understands pain and understands definitely giving it, but also understands receiving it. And so anyway, I think specific detail and visceral detail, and keep them reasonably short. You know, like sex scenes, I think are the same way. I think you could say the same thing about sex scenes as you do about fight scenes. You know, keep them pretty short, try to make it somewhat memorable, visceral detail a little bit. Little of that goes a long way in most of the genres we're writing, except if you're writing spicy, you know, which is great. So,
Yeah. You know, I one of my kind of freelance gigs that I still do from time to time is you know, editorial work on manuscripts for other writers. And recently I read or worked on a manuscript which was pretty well written, except for the fight scenes. And what the writer did, it was a very strange choice, was to go into like incredible, and I mean incredible, excruciating detail about every single beat of the fight.
too
As
much.
though, I mean, it was too much. It slowed the pace down
Yeah.
so much, and it was confusing, right? Because so many small, minute things are happening in the middle of a fight. You cannot possibly mention them all. So what do you leave out? How do you know what to leave out? What's important in a fight scene or any scene really? What do you keep? What do you leave out?
Well, I think the momentum of it is very important. You know, typically you have, you know, three kinds of fights, right? With your protagonist involved, either he or she is getting their ass kicked, which maybe happens, you know, earlier or maybe at the climax for a while. You have the ones where they get the drop on somebody and maybe, you know, dish out some punishment and maybe come back to bite them later. Or you have, you know, the kind of the big fight scenes where it is the momentum shifts. And I think you really have to pay attention to those momentum beats. And like I say, some significant visceral details, a little goes a long way to your point. So I think if you do that and give us, you know, the five senses too. What does it smell like? What does
Right.
it sound like? You know, there's so many fight scenes that you read that don't have, you know, what's the smell of the blood, you know, when your lip gets cracked open. Um, and maybe you don't even feel it because you're in the middle of it, but you smell it and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna need some stitches after this.
Yeah.
So I think those, you know, I think sketch it. I think it's not a full portrait, like you say, it's a sketch.
So I'm going to fasten on something that you said just now, which was a momentum beat. Talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and also how do you view the idea of momentum in your own work?
Yeah, so like I say, propulsive is my speed, is my kind of set speed. And so when there's a momentum shift, they tend to be fairly significant in my books, both to both extremes. There were a couple of parts of or a couple of scenes in my book, Shadow State, where um, there was some real interiority for my protagonist. Somebody close to him dies and he goes to light candles, and you know, it goes to to see the mother, and she's mad at him, and and he's just thinking a lot about grief, and that would stand out to the reader because there's not a lot of that in the book. So that's a real
Right.
big momentum shift narratively. And I think so I use that tonal kind of shift, I think, to signpost, pay attention here, or don't be bored. Here's something different for you. Here's something, show a different look. I was reading a lot of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Nick Cave is quite a philosopher of grief. He lost
Yeah,
his son,
really
who was
is.
young, and he's brilliant. And I was listening to his audiobook, and he had some things to say about grief, which were astonishing. And I literally set myself the challenge of writing something different about grief that hopefully would resonate somewhere near that. And so, like, we're magpies, right? We take things from everywhere. And so, so that was a big tonal shift for me. But momentum shifts within a scene, I think, that's that whole genre trope thing where somebody gets the upper hand, and you think that oh my God, is the protagonist going to die? And, somebody's in peril. And then all of a sudden something happens, the guy slips on a banana, whatever it is. And he's got the upper hand again, or just at the last second, some of these books, I just have these astonishing moments where, like, I don't, this isn't an exact example, but like where the protagonist is willing to lose one of his fingers to survive and
Right.
fight another day, like those kind of, like, very extreme. So I think within scenes, that's what I mean by momentum. But I think kind of like slowing it down, speeding up, getting interior, getting exterior, within the whole narrative, the overarching narrative.
Melissa, I think you had a question you wanted to.
I have so many
Yes.
questions on behalf of this chat.
We
don't think
we could do like we could do fast round, because I talk too much. So if you want to just give me
lightning
like 10,
round.
we
I've
could
never
we could
seen-
motor through a bunch.
Yeah, I've never seen this many questions in the chat. Okay, sorry, I lost it. And now I just lost you. Many new writers are struggling to find their unique voice. What advice do you have for writers who want to develop a unique voice?
Oh, that's great. Well, I think, when I was starting out, my dad, who also turned me on to the Matt Helm books, gave me all the Hunter Thompson books, which helped fuel my interest in politics. But he gave me Hell's Angels to start when I was like 12 years old. My dad was an old hippie radical, and thought I could handle it. And I'd like to reread those books now, because I think I get a lot different out of them than when I was 12 or 13. But Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, whatever. So, like a lot of young writers at that time, I think I was writing a lot like, Hunter Thompson-y kind of stuff, and in that genre, in that style. And really at that age, when you're a teenager and you're young, or anytime when you're starting out, often you are leaning on, somebody that you really love, and trying to emulate that. And I think that's fine. I think that's one of the ways that you kind of learn how to do it. But I think you have to, that then those are the training wheels, right? And then I think it just becomes about truth. It becomes less about like trying to, I want to write something in this genre because it's going to sell, or I want to, follow in these footsteps or whatever. And you do all that. You have to calibrate to the market and everything, but just about what am I passionate about in my life right now? What is true that I can share? And I think if you use that as your North Star, then you will have your own style. I don't know why, probably just from all those books that I read as a kid, that I'm so terse and propulsive and whatever. But it is something that I think it just takes time. But I think if you really just stay with truth, then I think you won half the battle.
Yeah, I think a lot of students in the program, especially younger writers, are impatient to have a voice. They want to know what it is, how to get it quickly, how to be unique, and how to protect the voice that they already have, right? They're afraid of reading something that's going to mess with their style. They're afraid of workshopping their work sometimes, because they think, well, people are going to try to change my style. And I don't mean this disrespectfully in any way, but if you're like a writer in your 20s or even in your 30s, you don't have a style yet. You have the beginnings of a style.
Yeah.
But that is something that's going to develop organically as you grow, as you continue to write. So, in my opinion, anyway, in that span of ages, you should be reading as much stuff as you possibly can, exposing yourself to
Yes.
all kinds of different voices and different styles and trying them on. And
Yeah,
out of
read
that,
widely, read widely. Yeah.
yeah, because I mean, like Frank, you referred to us as writers as magpies, and I really feel as though that's a virtue. That's something that we really cultivate and should cultivate, because on the other side of it, we've developed, we end up with a toolbox, so to speak, and
Yeah.
and from that toolbox we draw what tools we need to be in the service of what our real voice and style turns out to be.
Yeah. I agree.
So I say that to lovingly, really, to the students in this program.
Well, a related thing is my first lecture, my first announcement or whatever of the Unit 1. I always talk about um, the book that they are reading as part of their reading. You're reading section 1, section 2, and the guy, and I'm blanking on his name right now. He's really knows his stuff. It's great material, and I say this with all respect, but he is very vicious toward people who do not plot exquisitely. And like, we're Neanderthals. He has kind of a straw man argument, that people just sit down with a blank sheet of paper and their brain is empty, and then they just start writing a story, and how could anybody ever do that? And you and I were talking, Paul, about how we're both kind of what they call pantsers, which I hate that term so much. It almost makes me want to become a plotter. But right by the seat of our pants. When I started hearing that at conferences, I wanted to tear my hair out. And
What
but
would
anyway,
be a better term, Frank?
I don't know, free flow, something like flow, like in old school hip hop. We've got
Yeah.
flow.
Okay, or maybe
Um,
we're improvisers, like
Freestyle.
jazz players or something.
Jazz, yeah, music, drawing music always,
Wow.
All right.
but yeah. So I always tell them though that you when you're starting out, you do need to plot. You do need that structure. Most people do. I mean, I'm sure there are wunderkinds who don't need it, but I did, and then it fell away. I mean, it's that old saying of you need to learn the rules to know how to break the rules. So I do really believe, to as a slant rhyme to what you were saying about not having a style. That's the same thing. I mean, plotting, you have to just really put the blinders on and sit down and pace it out, and because you're learning it, you're just learning.
But I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before the event began tonight. The idea that you're writing thrillers, which is a genre that by and large those books are known for being incredibly tautly plotted, and yet you're not that kind of a plotter. You're an improviser. So how then are you able to kind of go against your own nature as a writer in order to develop these tight plots?
Yeah, so I had a transcontinental railroad problem with that book, where the tracks meet and they're like a foot apart when they finally get to the middle of the continent. Because so I had a couple of pages, I had an idea of, here's the villain, and it was he's recreating infamous political assassinations in the United States.
Right.
And why is he doing it? I didn't know when I started. And all sorts of things I didn't know. But I knew I actually had that pain as information was the first thing that came to me for that book. I was like, well, there's a book. That's a book. It just I was really you get captivated by things sometimes. I don't know where that came from, but anyway, so I had some elements, and I had an opening scene in my mind, and a couple of later scenes of some of the staged recreations of the assassinations, but that was it. And so what ended up happening was, as I wrote through it, I got a better and better idea of what was going on, and it really started to, I think that part of it is I have always am reading genre stuff, I'm watching it on TV, I'm going to the movies to see it, and so I think I've internalized that kind of narrative so much that I'm secretly plotting, subconsciously. So anyway, I had this major secondary character that was going along in the story in a certain way, and then midpoint of the novel, it's revealed that this person is a completely different person. and I didn't plan it at all. And I had written, and I usually write from beginning to end. I'm not one of those people who, I had some ideas, but I didn't write. But this particular time, for some reason, I had written a big chunk toward the end, and I all the stuff, and I had to redo like so much stuff. But I thought, if that surprised me, it will definitely surprise the reader. And I've heard subsequently, without people not knowing that story, they'll say, "Oh my God, I couldn't believe what happened with X." And so to me, that is the big payoff of being a pantser, is that improvisational thing. And where is it going to take you? Because no matter how good of a writer you are, well, I'm sure there are some people that can pull it off, exquisite plotters who can pull off a surprise, but usually, you're telegraphing something.
Yeah.
You almost have to be, and unless you're just like an idiot like me and like, I don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden. So I am really one of those people who, not in a woo-woo way, but I just let the characters write the book.
Here's another
It's more
question
fun
from,
too, right? It shouldn't be work, right? Because none of us are getting rich on it, so it's got to be fun.
well, yeah, I mean, it does have to be fun. It is fun. Some of it's work though. Come on. I mean, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Frank, how many drafts does a novel of yours typically go through?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, first of all, my first drafts are terrible, absolutely terrible. This guy that is my editor now at Crooked Lane, he was at St. Martin's and was a nonfiction editor. He had also done mystery editing at St. Martin's, but with me, I did the book on Groupon when it was going public and it was a big thing. And he, at one point, so I've got this, big five publisher, and he says, at one point he's like, I've got to see a draft, and I needed like 2 weeks to do a second draft before I was going. And I said I had never ever shown anybody a first draft because they're terrible. And he's like, just trust me, I don't care. And so I said, I'm gonna send it to you, and I'm gonna write a couple of pages of what I believe all of your notes are gonna be, so you'll know that I'm not an idiot, that I actually know what I'm. So I did that, and sure enough, it was everything I knew was terrible about it. He pointed out to, and we got to be friends. And so when he went and founded Crooked Lane, he told a mutual friend of mine, if he writes mysteries again, I want to work with him. So it worked out well. But I will write that terrible first draft. I will write a very substantive second draft, and then probably maybe like a partial third, and then a real fine-tuned polished draft. So probably like 3.5, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. But my first draft that people see is not the first draft ever.
Right.
It's like your grandma who would say, I can't go out without my face on,
Yeah. So, as you're writing, like, give me a sense of like what your writing process is on like, say, like a daily basis when
Well,
you're
it
working on
varies.
something.
Yeah, it varies. I've really been energized by teaching, here. And so when I'm teaching the classes, I try to it's almost like playing along at home, I want to write as they're writing. So I'll get into the class and I'll talk in the discussions and everything. And then I'm going to spend, it's like, it's already midnight, and I'm going to spend a couple hours writing. I write late at night, typically in the evening. I sit in a recliner. I have my laptop on like one of those little lap desks, like a piece of wood, and typically listen to music. If there's anything on TV, you can't pay attention to it. I mean, there's just your mind is not able to, or my mind is not able. A little music is good, and I try to just blow through the drafts. I don't go like I say, they're terrible first drafts, and that part of that is that I don't go back. When I was early, when I was learning, I was taught, a lot of writers will go write their 5 pages or whatever, like clockwork, and then the next day, you hear people, I start one sentence and then I stop, and that's how I start the next day. But you heard a lot of people go, I go back through what I wrote yesterday and I revise that, and then I start again. And I did that the first time. And, it's a good process. I mean, it felt a lot like work to me though. And so I just decided at some point, as part of developing my style, I guess, that I was just going to write through it. So I write through them. And sometimes I'll go back and put a note in, like if I think of something that I should have done earlier, or like put a scene here or whatever, I'll go, it's not like I won't look at it, but I won't do a big revision until I get the whole thing out. And I can go, you hear about all these writers who would lock themselves in a room, and well, Dashiell Hammett was famous for it. He'd go on some bender and then he'd sober up long enough to write a 50,000 word novel in 5 days or whatever. And I do go through spurts where I will, if I get if my wife and young son go out of town to see her folks, I will do some housework on a Saturday morning, and then I will sit down and get a Diet Coke and put some music on and write for like 9 hours. And so I do enjoy that. I've never had writer's block, knock on wood. There's always, in fact, my oldest son does have ADHD, and my wife said you absolutely have it too, and I think that's probably true. And I think for a writer, it's not a bad thing if you know how to cope with it or whatever. But I've always got like 73 ideas pinging around, and so that's my writing process. Like I catch as catch can, try to make regular progress, and I set myself a word count goal for the week, if I can get 10,000 out this week, because I try to look at like when I don't want my editor to forget about me. It's like very practical. If you wait too long, he's going to, or people, as you know, I had an editor once who acquired a book of mine and then left, like right as it came out. Like, you got to strike while the iron is hot in this business. People move around, and so I always think, all right, I really have to get this done in the next 2 months, and or when I took the term off, thanks to you, I was like, I have to finish this draft because I was given this time, and I did. And so I like to have a bit of a a bit of a sword of Damocles hanging over my head.
Hey, can I ask another question in the
Go
chat?
for it, please.
Do you feel like you build a relationship with your characters and they live in your head? How do you relate and get to know them? And do you do exercises for this?
Yeah, and some of you may know this in your own work, or may feel this in your own work. My first 2 novels were basically the protagonist is like a version of me. He's like this young journalist, and he gets into trouble, whatever. And it was like a idealized version of myself. And so I knew that guy really well. And it's I'm almost embarrassed now. The stuff I wrote when I was 22, I don't know at 56 if I should even ever look at it again. But John Green gave it a good review. So back before he was John Green. And so I feel like it did okay at the time, but that was really easy. But in terms of as I've matured and the characters are not just versions of myself, I do fall in love with certain characters. I mean, I absolutely do. This character, kind of co-lead character in Shadow State is the president. Wyetta Johnson is her name, and she is disabled from Afghanistan. Kind of what happened with Tammy Duckworth, losing part of her leg, and so Rafe Hendricks, who's the protagonist, they're fighting together, and he rescues her. But she's the alpha in the relationship, and she gives him a hard time all the time. And she's lesbian, and she steals women from him, and like she just gives him a ton of crap, and but they love each other. But he's fun, but he's more of a standard issue in some ways. She's like I just love her. I could hang out with her all day, every day. So yeah, I fall in love with certain characters. I did have my project editor for that book is a lesbian woman, but she's not, this president is a Black lesbian disabled woman. I have no writing her, but I always just come from the place of I'm going to write human beings, and I'm very sensitive to equity and inclusion in voices that have been suppressed historically getting a chance. And so I was very careful to be respectful, but I did have at least a lesbian project editor who she said, yeah, it works. But I was really scared when it came out that people were going to throw me off a bridge or something, but I just love her so much. I mean, I'm glad she was accepted as a character by readers.
Here's another question in the chat. Excuse me. Do you have an all-time favorite book? If so, what is it? And what about it caught your heart?
Well, before it was Oprah's book club pick, I will say this because that kind of crushed me because then everybody read it. Anna Karenina, which I came to in my early 30s, almost made me quit writing because, and it was that great translation that the husband and wife team, I can't remember their names, but they also did War and Peace, which I have on my shelf. And I told my daughter the other day, I'm going to finally start. Anyway, I read that, and it's a beautiful story, but I mean, his writing is incredible. And the thing that grabbed my heart, though, was Constantine Levin, because my dad, when I was a kid, he's this lefty hippie and atheist, and you're not going to get baptized and all this kind of stuff. Well, he came to religion later in his life, but I was already ruined by then, and so I don't pretend to know, so I've always been agnostic. Like I would be presumptuous of me to say one way or the other. But anyway, Constantine Levin in the book goes through, he's like that, but he goes through a spiritual journey that just grabbed me because it made sense. I was like, oh my God, this actually, I can see this. This is profound to me. I identified with the character to a certain extent, and I think I've heard later that Tolstoy, that was the character that was closest to Tolstoy. He put so much care into it that kind of tracks, in a similar age when he wrote it. So that's my favorite book, just because it's so brilliant. But I mean, I have, 1A, that changes every week. Every time you read something, I just get, or different stages of your life. I remember when my now 20, almost 21-year-old was like 10, The Road came out with Cormac McCarthy, and I read that. And I immediately, I mean, it's like a video game almost, but it's like the father and son, and he's going to protect his son. And then I recently read Blood Meridian, a very different book, and it blew my mind. There's different, it changes, but I would say Anna Karenina has never been knocked off the pillar.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised to hear you say that, because it's not, I mean, not like I thought you were going to come out with, The Thin Man or something, but it's so different from what you're writing, right? I mean, it's not a thriller. It's a very, in some respects, some aspects of it, like I might point to some of those chapters with Levin, are rather slow moving. They're very inwardly focused, right?
Yes. Yeah. Very interior. I mean, I love it as a reader. I mean, James Salter, sentence by sentence. I am name checking a lot of old cis white guys, and I apologize. I am so sorry. I realize this is horrible, but James Salter, sentence by sentence, I think was maybe one of the best writers in the English language, and he was very slow as well. And if you can do, I just can't do it. That's my confession. Is probably the reason I don't do it is I can't do it. I don't know how to do it well. I mean, it just it's not true to me, to who I am, to put this stuff out there about I do a little interior reality, but in terms of just the narrative scope of, the landscape and all that, I wish I could.
Well, I mean, you have to be the writer you are. You can't be the writer you wished you were, or that you admire. You can't turn into Tolstoy or something like that.
No. But I'm trying to think of, like, I've been blown away by so many women writers too, like The Shipping News by Annie Proulx, and I mean, just that was one of the first big books in grad school that just blew my mind. And I read wide.
Was she teaching up there? Wasn't she in Montana?
I don't know if she was. She wasn't at that time, but she might well have been. But that was when that came out, and I read it, and I was just flabbergasted.
Yeah, amazing.
Her character work and the heartbreak. I mean, I also like the heartbreak and the tragedy, which I, do in more of a cartoony, thrillery kind of way. But yeah, my tastes are wide ranging and a little more highbrow than the stuff I actually write. But I like The Housemaid too. I'm like, everybody's talking about The Housemaid. Let me read that. And sometimes you read these books and they're awful. Like I've heard, I'm not going to even say the writer's name, but there are a few really popular writers now that fellow writers will read and say, I can't believe anybody buys this. Well, first of all, it's because they know how to tell a story. They may not be good writers technically, but like Dan Brown back in the day, I was the first person to review the Da Vinci Code, and Booklist was a must recommend book. If you didn't like a book, you just didn't review it. And his characters are he's ridiculous. But what I said and what I found in it, and the reason it became so hugely popular is I said it has more twists than a licorice factory. And that's he's brilliant at that. So that's what a lot it really does come down to more than character. I think your regular reader story, man, they want that plot, especially in genre. They want those twists and turns.
Well, I think that's why that explains a writer like Michael Crichton too, right? I
Yeah.
mean, he's not an elegant prose stylist. His characters are basically cardboard cutouts,
Yeah.
but his stories and his ideas are, just phenomenal.
Yeah. Now the guy who brings it all together is Stephen King, right? I mean, he just can do. He's a hell of a writer. I mean, he's not Tolstoy, but he's actually quite a good writer. But he comes up with amazing twists and turns. If you like thrillers, the Hitman Last Job genre was done very well. Is it Billy Sunday? Is that the name of the book? It's the name after the character. It came out like 3 or 4 years ago. It's a doorstop of a novel, but it just pulled me through. This guy's a hitman who's going to hang it all up and do one last job, and we all know how that turns out.
Yeah. What's great about these Wireside chats, or one of the great things about them, is like, you get to hear working writers talk about not just about their own work, but about the work of other writers. I mean, like, Frank, I can hear the enthusiasm in your voice for other works of literature, work by other writers. You're not just a writer, you're an enthusiastic reader.
Oh my God. And can I just say, because I know we're almost out of time, the thing I wanted to say was with my students, I have learned so much. And I actually went and did a polished draft on my latest book based on something I read in one of the students' drafts last term. And the lines were so good. And I'm like, I need some really good lines on every page. And I didn't hit that, but I was like, I'm going to put a killer line on every page. But I added like 50, and it was all because of that. And just the conversations that we have. I actually workshopped a scene with them last term on the first workshop. I said, please don't feel at all obligated to read this even or comment on it. I got some really good feedback. I don't know if I should have done that, but I just thought it would be fun for them to see.
It's fine. I think it's great if an instructor can be that open and vulnerable, to soliciting feedback from, because I mean, really, I find the same thing, Melissa. I would venture to predict that you do as well, that, we learn a lot from our students. I don't know everything about writing, far from it,
No. I just feel like I've got a lot of experience is probably why I'm doing this, but I'm just a writer alongside them. That's all I am. That's all I ever think I am. And that's all I ever will be. And you know what? That's great, right? I mean, that's what I wanted when I was in my MFA program. I wanted a working writer to like look at the nuts and bolts and give me ideas and tear it apart and build it up. And, that's what I want to do.
Yeah. Well, that's why you're a great instructor in our program, because that's what our program is really all about. It's approaching writing on that level or from that standpoint.
Yeah, it's you put together an ideal program for my taste. So I really appreciate being here.
Frank, would you like to share any social media handles so we can find you and follow you?
Yeah, on X, I'm at Sennett Report, SENNETT Report. I did that before Colbert. So anyway, and I'm the publicist for Lollapalooza made me get an Instagram many years ago. It's kind of a long story, but it's Frank Sinatra. I would never have chosen that myself, but she stole my phone and put it together, and I've kept it. And then I'm on Facebook. I have a novel, writer's page is Frank Sennett, and then so that's my threads as well.
Okay.
I think.
And don't forget Blue Sky.
Oh yeah, so I'm Sennett Report on Blue Sky as well. I love Blue Sky. Yeah.
I'm really enjoying Blue Sky as well.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to 9 o'clock, which, as you know, is the end of our Wireside chat. So I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I want to thank Melissa, as always, for joining me, and a special thanks to Frank Sennett for being our guest. Just a
Any
wonderful
questions
chatting
didn't
with
get
you.
answered, if any questions didn't get answered, email me at my SNHU account and I will answer them personally, because I am sorry that I talked so much that I didn't get to enough questions. So I just wanted to
No
throw that.
apologies necessary. You were fantastic. It was a really enjoyable evening. I want to
Yeah.
wish everybody a good night, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, so. Thank you.